All right, on this week's episode of Whitetail Cribs, we are visiting with Zach Jost. Zach lives on a private lake and runs a European school mounting business. In this episode, you get to check out a bunch of giant antlers, so let's just get right into it.
Hey guys, come on in. I'm Zach Jost, and this is my man cave. Started here with the kind of the start of all this man cave and this whole place is my wife's grandpa. This was his old lake house, and we moved in here, finished construction a little bit ago. So I wanted a shrine for him. He's harvested a lot of bucks through the years. My father-in-law has some of his other bucks, but some of these were his harvest through the years. This was a buck he hunted for years, found the sheds of, got that mounted. But it's a big thanks to him that all this is possible. I am just incredibly thankful to him that, we get to have a sweet setup like this. So a few of these bucks, especially this one in the corner, has an interesting story. He shot that on a piece, and a week later, I harvested one of my biggest bodied bucks the next week, and it was within 100 yards of each other. So those bucks were same ground, same week. It was pretty cool, and they both died. Within 100 yards of each other. We helped with the recovery on both ends of it, and it was just a really cool story through that and hunt on both sides. So got a few turkeys. I grew up in Marion County, Hillsborough, Kansas. We've got a lot of Rios, Easterns, and hybrids there. So a lot of cool turkeys that have, I've got the white tips on the edge, or they get the cream or the darker. And so you just get a lot of cool variations with the turkeys there. A few of these sheds, this is a shed that my brother actually found. This is the biggest shed I have. It's 93 inches. I know it's hard to tell, but these tines are huge, over 13-inch G3, and it's just one of the biggest sheds I'll probably ever have in my possession. But of course my brother found it. Super jealous of him that he let me hold on to it and keep it here. The shed I've got here, this was from this buck. This was the first archery buck I've ever shot. He was shot on I think it was December 29th. So I had a couple days left of season, and I had to go back to Manhattan. And my father-in-law, Brad Crable, he set me up on this deer. He knew right where he was coming in. He knew the bachelor group he was coming in, and sure enough, that night, it was perfect. It was ice cold, almost dead calm, and I had every deer on the farm within range of me that evening. The bachelor group starts showing up, and slowly but surely they start moving in closer, and last 15 minutes of light, I see him step over the ridge, and he steps in and walks within 6 yards of my stand, and I made a perfect shot on me, ran like 60, 70 yards and piled up. But I'm pretty proud of him. He's 161 inches, and he is just a beautiful, beautiful big 9. Another buck shot on the same property, another crazy hunt where I saw almost every deer on the farm that night. That was November 3rd. He was crossing our food plot. We've got a giant food plot, and he was coming across this plot, and he was just on a mission. And I hit the grunt tube one time, and he just turns, looks right at me, and works a scrape at 40 yards, and I tried to be as patient as I could. And he eventually worked to me, and I had a perfect trail that split either side. He was done, and he was at 8 yards, and I smoked him and ran right up the hill, and I watched him fall. So that was pretty cool. On this side, I've got my brother's buck. This is my brother's biggest buck. It was a rifle kill. We were back home, and we were all pretty excited to go out, and I had a friend from college and my brother, and we were set up on this pasture, and I saw this deer run across the pasture in front of me, and I didn't think he was that big. I don't know what I was looking at, but I didn't think he was that big. Next thing I hear my brother shoot once, and he calls me and says, "Hey, I've got this buck down." And I wasn't too excited at first, and I walk up on him, and he's like, I couldn't believe it. He's 152, and he's a heck of a deer. I've also got a sweet gun cabinet that my grandpa Jost built for me. I showed up to his house one day a few summers ago, and I had a couple pictures. I said, Grandpa, do you think you can make something like this? Do you think you can build a curio cabinet, for my guns and stuff? And he's like, oh yeah, well, let me see the pictures. Showed him a couple pictures, and within a couple months he had this built. And so it's pretty impressive. He's over 90, and he created something like this, and I'm just beyond impressed. So a turkey on top was my wife's grandpa. Bob was his name, Bob Crable, and he had that one full mount, huge turkey, over 11-inch beard, like 1.25 spurs, something like that. He's a monster. But that's about it for the man cave. Let's go check out my shop out here where I do all my work and have a few other heads hanging. So this is where all the magic happens. I've got a European mount business, ZJ Europeans. Look me up if you want one of the best European mounts done. I'm your man. I hung a few more of my mounts out here. I've got the mounts, sheds. This buck here was one of the reasons that I started the European mount business. I saw the work that was done, and it was just kind of sad that it came back. Bones were falling apart. The skull was flaking, the antlers were discolored, and it just didn't look right. So I decided that I could clean skulls, and I wanted to give people a better quality job than what I had seen there and what my family had gotten. So that's kind of what kickstarted everything for me was seeing how those deer were done. This deer is one of my favorite. I shot him back home. He was just a mile from my dad's farm, and I was a senior in high school, and I was hunting with one of my good buddies that passed away a few years ago. Rifle season, and it was a weird year where it was about 65 degrees, and so I was in coveralls with a cutoff on underneath. It was just so hot that day. I just remember, it was a little bit misty. We're walking down to the field where we're gonna set up, and while we're walking down, him and I are just talking, and I see out of the corner of my eye, I just see this flash of antler, and all I see was that rib cage on the side, and we just froze in our tracks and stopped right there. He looked at us and snorted, and right when he stood up and started to take off, and I squeezed the trigger, and he went right over the hill and dropped right there. And that deer, I will never forget that hunt, that moment with my good buddy there. This other buck, the other deer in there that Bob shot, that was the one that he shot up north. This deer was the one I shot later that week. Biggest body deer I've ever shot, probably will ever shoot. He was over 300 pounds. He's a cow. He's just a tank of a deer. He was 145. Yeah, his body kind of made up for it. He was a tank. I shot him. He was following a doe. He stopped at a scrape tree at 40 yards, and I had just this tiny little hole in a cedar tree. I remember going back behind my stand. He was downwind and everything. I thought that I was just in trouble, and he had stopped perfectly broadside and put the 40-yard pin on it, let it fly, and he ran 80, 90 yards right up the hill, and I watched him fall just behind a cedar. So on a few of these others, I've got, this was my biggest Missouri buck. My brother-in-law and his family have some land in Missouri, and they were nice enough to let me go with them, and I have harvested 4 bucks from there. All that kind of, about that 130, 140 range. Beautiful country up there, but that's my biggest one. Deadhead I found, and I'm going to restore him. He needs to be restored. He's a really cool deer. He's about 183. Once I get him finished, who knows what he could be, I've got a lock set. It's actually one of my best friends. He's found this again back in Hillsboro. The bigger buck is 206 and some change, and the smaller buck was 139, 140. Found those in a pond. They were nasty, just covered in muck. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, this just big swamp donkey pulls out of there. This thing was just a monster. I forced him to hang it here in my shed. I just have to hang it. Deadhead I found this year. A couple more Missouri bucks. And then this other big 8 was another big deadhead I found back home. On this side of the wall, I've got sheds throughout the years, a lot of match sets. This buck here, I nicknamed him Phantom. The story on him was I acquired this land just outside of Bueller, and the first year that I started hunting it, I didn't get many pictures of anything big. I had a couple 120-inch, 115-inch 8 points or smaller bucks like that, and finally a buck like this, I mean, biggest buck I've ever had on camera. He shows up, and all my pictures were foggy and misty, and I could not tell what he was. I could never define what this buck was. I just knew he was big framed, and he was big. Nicknamed him Phantom. I had one encounter with him, opening day of season, and I was walking to the stand, and when I walked in, I bumped him. There were multiple other bucks in the area that were actually sparring, and I was like, oh, okay, well, that'll be a distraction. Well, as I snuck in, I heard a deer take off, and sure enough, on camera, I've got pictures of him darting off. And November 6th, day finally came. He messed up. He came to check two small bucks I had in the food plot, and those two small bucks were kind of messing around, and they were acting like they were the biggest, baddest guy around. And all of a sudden their demeanor changes, and I'm trying to figure out why they changed or what was going on. And I look down to my right, and I see his rack. I just remember seeing his split G2 on his right side. I remember seeing that, and I was like, oh, crap. And he's just 20 yards right beside me. I get drawn, and he just walks right out in front of these little dinks, and about a 20-yard shot, and he ran 50 yards. I watched him fall. And this Phantom, he is my highest scoring buck. He's my biggest buck I've got. He's 187 inches and some change. And I don't know if I'll ever shoot anything bigger than that, but he's the biggest deer I'll ever kill. He's a monster. I was so happy that day. I called my father-in-law. I called my buddy Dylan Delk. Those guys were as excited as I was on the phone. So through the years, it's been pretty cool on this property. It was new, so we didn't have much history with this deer. But through the years, I've gained property around there, and we have found multiple sheds from him through the years. Kind of the same story with a buck that I nicknamed Petey. He ran with Phantom the same year I harvested him. He ran with him all the time. I harvested him that next year. Then the following years, I have found his sheds. And so it just helps build that story. Another buck from that area found his shed. I actually hunted him. I named him Peter Griffin. He was just a big, kind of fat deer that just bullied everything off and chased everything off. But old Peter Griffin, I couldn't make it happen, and I found his deadhead this spring. So he has a little story too. But the buck I harvested this last year is 142. He was on my father-in-law's land, and that was November 12, I believe, and he walked right underneath the stand. I had a little buck and a doe about 15 yards from the stand, and I hear this deep grunt coming down the tree row, and all I see is his rack and his head down, and he literally walks right underneath my stand, walks past me a little ways, and I took the shot, and he ran behind the trees and folded. A few sheds from some of the properties I want to show you. This was a shed from Marion County. My biggest shed is 87 inches and is just an absolute monster. I remember pulling this out of the grass, and all I could see were the tips of the tines, and I didn't know what I was getting into, and I saw the base sticking out, pull that out, and I couldn't believe it. Biggest shed, heaviest shed. I've got one I found this last year. This was just under 84 inches. I was shed hunting with Dylan, and we're checking a few waterways out from the timber and from the hedgerows and everything, and he's like, oh yeah, just drive down this waterway. And right as I pulled into that waterway, I started hollering because I spotted this thing just shining in the sun, and we go flying up there and pick this sucker up. Looked forever for the other side, but that's pretty exciting, find something like that. My biggest 3 that I've got and the biggest 4. This shed, he's got 14-inch G2s, his G3s 13 and a half, but this guy was a typical 8-point, and he had matching kickers on both sides, and he was just an absolute monster. He even has a little hook. I've never seen anything like this. He's got a little hook on the base, and he had a little bit of, I swear it looked like brain on the inside there, but I think it was just infection on his base. This buck this was his 3.5-year-old sheds, a buck I called Massey Ferguson. I've watched him since he was 1.5, and he was a 5x6 as a 2.5-year-old, and watched him grow. Last year he was would have just broke 170 as a 4.5-year-old. He was a 6x6 with extra kickers everywhere. Short time, but just extremely massive. He disappeared on the property. I'm hoping he's still alive, but he's going to be my number one target buck if he shows up. One buck that haunted me for a while, I nicknamed him Gavin. He was just a skinny, spindly buck, and I watched him grow up also. These are some sheds through the years, and he never really put on a whole lot, but through the years, I've had multiple encounters. 2 years ago was when I hit him. I relaxed too much and I shot low. I shot just below his elbow, and he took off, and we followed blood. I thought I made a better hit, but unfortunately it wasn't as good as I thought. We found his shed from last year, found that shed, and this year I found another one of his old sheds, and later this year I found these sheds, and I knew that he had shed in December, and I actually talked to the neighbor later this year, and he had seen a shed buck around Christmas. He had seen a buck that was in his pond almost every day. Must have been running a fever or something like that, and sure enough, it was this buck. So the chase is over for this guy, but we've got a heck of a story behind him. I've got a lot of history with him, and I might just have to go get his skull and mount these back on him. We'll see.